Okay, we're back. And so in this video, we are going to cover the next section on confusion over inflation. And so what does that mean? It's basically you're going to understand how inflation can shift purchasing power between different groups, how it blurs the signals in the marketplace about supply and demand, and how it presents some benefits and some challenges to our economy. So our learning outcomes here, explaining how it can cause redistributions of purchasing power, the ways it can blur the perception of supply and demand, and the benefits and challenges, basically what I just said. So to start, let's talk about how inflation is perceived differently by the public and by economists. Many people see high inflation as a serious threat to their financial stability because it reduces their purchasing power. You can't buy as much stuff. In the 1990s, economist Robert Shiller did a survey, and he found that 52% of Americans ranked preventing inflation as a top priority, alongside education quality. And this was in the 1990s, and not a lot has changed. Only 4% disagreed that preventing inflation was a top priority. Economists view inflation differently. Mild or moderate inflation is often seen as manageable, and only 18% of economists agreed with the public that controlling inflation should be a high priority. Another 18% actually disagreed that it was a high priority. So this difference in perspectives reflects that economists have a different way of thinking about inflation and about its complexities. Many people in the public, they just look at it as, it's a risk to their everyday spending power. Prices are going up, prices are going up, prices are going up. My wages aren't going up, my wages aren't going up. There's a disconnect. And we see that. We saw earlier in another section where we're talking about the labor productivity index was increasing, but wages were staying stagnant. And so we do care about inflation. We feel it. We feel it deeply. It hurts our wallet. From an economist's perspective, they look at inflation a little differently. So to understand why they're less concerned about moderate inflation, consider a thought experiment. This is in your textbook. It's called The Land of Funny Money. So imagine there's a place where all prices, wages, and money, all of a sudden, all of those dollar amounts suddenly increased by 20% overnight. So since everything increases proportionately, prices, wages, and money, it's all 20% increase overnight. Well, their purchasing power remains the same. They can still buy the same amount of goods and the same amount of services with their income, but there's 20% inflation. Right? So this thought experiment really highlights the fact that in the real world, inflation rarely affects all prices, all wages, and all incomes equally. Doesn't happen that way. There are winners and there are losers when it comes to inflation. Some people experience inflation more acutely than others, especially when their wages don't keep up with rising prices. And that uneven impact is a major reason for the public's concern about inflation, and it drives elections. So why is inflation a problem if it doesn't affect everyone equally? Well, the answer is that it can distort economic signals and it can create a lot of different challenges. So here are some of the key problems that inflation has. One of those is this unintended redistribution of purchasing power. As mentioned earlier, inflation doesn't affect everyone the same way. It can shift purchasing power from some groups to others, and we'll dive deeper into that. Another one is blurred price signals. Prices play a pretty important role in conveying information about supply and demand. And inflation, because it's changing the price levels, it can distort those signals. It can make it harder for businesses and for individuals to make informed economic decisions, not knowing what the prices will be. And then the third one, long-term planning challenges. Again, you can't predict what inflation is going to be. You don't know what things are going to cost in the future. And so it, again, makes it difficult to plan for the future, especially for something like retirement. We have to assume that decades from now, when we retire, we're going to have X amount of dollars, but that X amount of dollars has to be adjusted for inflation. What's the inflation going to be 30 years from now? It's a cumulative effect over time. So it's really hard to make really accurate long-term planning. So we're going to look at each one of those separately here. So let's look at the redistribution of purchasing power. So inflation hurts people in several situations. If you hold cash, if you got money sitting in a bank account or a savings account even, well, when prices rise, the value of what cash you have sitting in a bank account or stashed under your pillow, that value erodes because that value isn't changing, but prices are. Your cash is staying steady, but prices are going up. So if you have a lot of cash holdings, you're losing during inflation. Now, if you have financial assets and you're invested, then the returns on certain financial assets like bonds, like debt, corporate debt, treasury bonds, T-bills, those often don't keep up with inflation because bonds pay a fixed percentage payment. And so you tend to lose purchasing power because as inflation, there's something called the real return. So your bond might be paying a 4% nominal interest rate coupon, but if there's a 5% rate of inflation in the market, well, you're getting a 4% return, but the inflation is 5%. So really, you're losing 1%. We call that negative 1% real return. And so you're losing money. You're not getting enough interest generated on your financial assets to make up for the inflation rate. And then taxes can complicate things because they're often applied to the nominal interest earnings. So let's say you do earn 4% and inflation is 5%. And so you're losing 1%, but really you're losing more than 1% because you got to pay taxes on that 4%. That 4% nominal interest, that's interest income. And so now you have to pay, 10, 15, 20, 25, 35% tax rate on the interest income. So really you're not just losing negative 1%, you're losing more than that. So taxes can complicate things. Wages. If wages don't rise as quickly as prices, then people's earnings decrease. You have less money to be able to buy things. So, and that's a real problem. I mean, wage adjustments are often lagging behind inflation, and they create at least a temporary loss of purchasing power. For some people, a permanent loss of purchasing power because wages never keep up with the inflation. And that's just a sad reality. And then the last one here is people who are on fixed incomes. I mean, if all you have is what's coming in through the your 401k payments, you've retired, or your Social Security checks, those you're not creating any new dollars to go into that. So you're getting what you get, and so your income is particularly vulnerable when there are price increases. All right, this figure illustrates how inflation erodes the real value of the minimum wage over time. So nominal minimum wage has increased over the years, right? The nominal minimum wage, but its purchasing power has actually declined significantly. You've probably heard this a million times, but there's several people in politics who want to increase the minimum wage so that it reflects more of what it was intended to be, a living wage. That was why it was passed way back when. And for it to be a living wage, at least in today's terms, it would need to be up to about $17 per hour for it to be comparable to what it had used to be. And we're so far away from that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The purchasing power of minimum wage, though, has really declined over time. And you can see in this pattern, there's a pattern here, right? Every time minimum wage is increased by Congress, there's a slow erosion until the next increase, and then there's a slow erosion, and the next increase, and there's a slow erosion, and the next increase, and there's a slow erosion. So it's a political football. Congress passes a bill, it increases the minimum wage, and then they sit on it for a few years, or a decade and a half, or 2 decades, as we've seen here in modern time. There has not been an increase since this peak right here as far as the federal minimum wage, right? So there is just a slow, gradual decrease in the purchasing power for anyone who earns minimum wage, which is not going to be everybody, but it's going to be somebody. So overall, though, we can see here from between 1965 and 2020, the federal minimum wage dropped by about 30% in terms of its purchasing power. So people who earn minimum wage today can buy much less with their earnings than what they could in the past. All right, so let's see. some of the beneficiaries. Who wins? Who are the winners of inflation? It harms some people, right? Some people lose, but it can actually benefit some people as well, especially if you have things like fixed rate loans or if you have real property, real assets. So example, a borrower with a fixed rate loan sees their debt repayments actually lose value in real terms over a long period of time. So myself, I'm a homeowner and I bought my home in 2015 and my monthly payment is set in $2015. And now it's 2024 when I'm recording this. We've had significant inflation between 2015 and 2024. So every dollar I earn is received in 24 terms, but it's paying off a 2015 loan. And because the value of money has not the value, but the nominal value of those dollars have increased over time, that 2015 payment, it's not so bad anymore. It's not as brutal on me as it used to be. So another example though, so let's say you have a loan with a 9% interest rate and inflation rises to 9%. Well, the real interest rate effectively drops to 0. You're paying 9%, you're receiving, let me think about this. Yeah, you're paying 9%. Inflation rises to 9%, which means in theory, your wages will go up to 9% as well. That real interest rate is effectively 0, and that reduces the burden on you. Like homeowners with fixed rate mortgages, like I just explained, the property value often increases with inflation, but the mortgage payment stays the same. That allows you to build equity in your home. Hopefully, you also have some increased income over time that helps you make those payments. If you own real estate, gold, collectibles, assets that appreciate in value over time, that can also serve as a hedge against inflation because oftentimes they at least rise with the value inflation, if not more. Businesses, if they have the power to raise prices, like utility companies, essential services, things people can't do without, they usually pass their cost increases on to consumers to protect their profits. Governments can have fixed interest debt, and so they can see a real debt burden as they repay those dollars. But that debt burden becomes less and less. You may have heard of the term, we can inflate our way out of the United States debt. And that's been something that people have been talking about for a very long time. We can just inflate our way out of the debt. And then the last one, landlords, real estate investors, they benefit because rents will increase and their mortgage payments on their properties are the same. So there's definitely people who win during times of inflation. All right, so this uneven impact, like we said, it changes purchasing power across groups. And that has broad social effects. And it has a sense of an unfairness, right? Our society is not structured fairly to Group A and Group B, the winners and the losers. And it's because of this arbitrary redistribution of purchasing power, right? Inflation creates a sense of injustice. It shifts wealth. It benefits some groups, like those who are borrowers, those who are asset holders. It harms others, those who are savers, those who have cash in the bank, those who are not investing, those who are on fixed incomes, those who are renting their home instead of owning their home. It harms them disproportionately. So we have to be careful about that. If we look back to the 1920s, Germany had extreme hyperinflation. In early 1920s, 1923, all of this directly led to Hitler's rise to power. It exemplifies really the severe inflation that they experienced contributed to social unrest. It contributed to political upheaval. The government that was in power prior to, well, I'll show you here. This is a video. I'm not going to play it here. I'll let you watch it on your own time. But this video will go into this in a little bit more detail, and it's really worth watching. So it shows how inflation redistributed wealth and it destabilized the German society. And this was the result of World War I, right? We experienced this in the United States as well, but not to the extent that Germany did because they lost the war. So in the 1920s, the German currency, the mark, lost value. It lost it at a staggering rate. Prices were doubling every few days. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of many of the middle-class Germans. They spent their life's work that vanished almost overnight. People on retirement incomes, on fixed incomes, were devastated. It left pensions worthless, right? Cost of living started to increase beyond reach. And so, in contrast to that, the people who had real assets could still pay off their debts. They were fine. They could get on with their life. So there was a deepened social divide, and it's this extreme financial hardship that people experienced and this sense of betrayal that contributed to the disillusionment with the government at the time, the Weimar Republic. And that was the government at the time before the Reich. So a lot of Germans just felt abandoned. They felt abandoned by the system. They felt abandoned by their government. They became more receptive to radical ideologies, and it created fertile ground for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The hyperinflation crisis was a big factor in that social and political instability that led to the Nazi Party's ascent. And this shows how inflation has far-reaching consequences beyond just economic hardship. So really good little documentary that I would recommend you take a look at it. It's really fascinating to me. Okay, now let's turn to another problem that's caused by inflation: blurred price signals. So prices are really important for coordinating economic activity. They provide information about supply and demand. It helps businesses determine what do they need to produce, and it helps consumers decide what they need to buy. So when inflation causes prices to rise inconsistently across different goods and services, it becomes a little more difficult to interpret what those price signals are. We struggle, to react to the economic signals effectively. It leads to some market inefficiencies. So, for example, in Israel in 1985, they had 500% inflation, so hyperinflation. That hyperinflation forced stores to avoid using price tags because the inflation was causing prices to rise so fast that if they started putting price tags, by the next day, they'd need another price tag and another one and another one, which made it very difficult for consumers to make a decision on what they were trying to buy. And so it was an unintended consequence. It made buying more difficult for the consumer, and it made it more difficult for the business to communicate pricing. And so you're just getting blurred signals. You can't really tell what you're buying, what it's worth, especially from day to day. So we have to be careful about that. The last challenge is how inflation makes long-term planning difficult. So unpredictable inflation rates, it makes it hard for individuals to plan for their retirement needs. Imagine you're saving for retirement. You don't know how much you're going to need. You don't know what money is going to be worth 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. You have no idea. So, we're going to focus on inflation-related tactics. Businesses are going to delay their payments. They're going to create new price lists. They're going to adjust their markups. They're going to focus on things that are inflation-related during periods of inflation instead of focusing on things that are productivity-related, instead of focusing on innovation, instead of focusing on improving qualities or improving services. So it makes it difficult for people to plan for the long term. It makes it difficult for businesses to plan for the long term. We're all just managing inflation when we should be managing how to live better, how to operate better. And it's not the most productive use of our time. So this figure here, it's going to show you the relationship between inflation rates and labor productivity in the United States from 1961 to 2020. And this, I think, is really important. It shows that there have been periods when rising inflation rates were followed by lower productivity rates. And there are times when lower inflation rates correspond to increasing productivity rates. So there is a link, potentially, between inflation and labor productivity. But it doesn't always hold true. There's other factors that can influence inflation beyond just labor productivity, but it is kind of interesting to kind of take a dive into this and look and see. And you can see like it's kind of that opposite pattern here. You can see in the 70s during the oil crisis, when inflation started to increase, labor productivity started to tank. Labor productivity actually dipped into the negatives in during these high periods of inflation. So it's interesting that there's this opposite relationship that happens. They kind of bounce back and forth like that. All right, last slide. So we focused a lot on the challenges of inflation, but we also have to acknowledge that low inflation, moderate inflation, low inflation, like 2% is our target. There are some benefits. It's not all bad. It helps to prevent deflation, for one. We don't want deflation, right? We talked about that earlier. It can have severe negative consequences. It puts people into a mental state where they're not sure where the bottom is. All of a sudden, prices are going down. Where's the bottom? What's the lowest price? I'm going to hold off my investment. I'm going to hold off spending. We don't want deflation. We want just a little bit of inflation every year. That helps to discourage those crazy behavioral patterns that we see during the downward spirals. So moderate inflation, just a little bit, it helps to reduce, it can gradually reduce the real value of wages, but it does so kind of in a gradual pattern. It takes a long time, which then allows us to make adjustments in our labor costs without requiring nominal wage cuts. So if you think about that, we don't like to give wage cuts. We don't like to cut people's wages. Having a little bit of inflation over time is kind of the equivalent to a wage cut without changing someone's actual pay rate. So that's not always a good thing, right? It doesn't sound like it's very worker friendly for me to say that, but it gives businesses some flexibility when they need it, when the economic conditions are changing, when they're up against headwinds, when the economy slows a little bit and they can't afford to give someone a pay increase. But if there's a little bit of inflation, maybe they can bring in some more revenue without the cost changes, without the nominal change in the wages. We don't like to cut wages, even though we may have to sometimes. We like to keep wages where they are. We made a commitment to our employees. Inflation allows us to bring in a little bit more revenue without incurring additional changes in our cost structure. So there is some good to be said about that. But we have to be careful of the contract that we make, the social contract with our employees. All right. And then lastly, it helps to facilitate wage flexibility, right? In a world with zero inflation, it's difficult to adjust wages downward when it's necessary. So a small amount of inflation just makes these adjustments a little bit easier. All right, so in the next video, we're going to talk about indexing, and we'll look at the limitations of indexing. Specifically, I want to take a quick, kind of a critical look at indexing when it comes to things like the minimum wage. We don't index the federal minimum wage, but we do in some states. I think it's an interesting thing to look at. So we'll deal with that in the next video.